Hello and welcome to the 12th and last episode in this second series of Among the Ancients, a close readings podcast from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones and I'm joined as ever by Emily Wilson. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Tom.
And today we're talking about the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and his book that's usually known in English as The Meditations. We'll be using the translation by Gregory Hayes, published by the Modern Library. It's sad to be coming to the end of the series, though Marcus Aurelius would no doubt advise us to bear the sadness with indifference, that all things must pass. Marcus was said by Machiavelli and Gibbon and many others to be the last of a run of 5 so-called good emperors who ruled Rome for most of the 2nd century CE. Machiavelli was making a distinction in his discourses on Livy, is this right, between those who came to the throne by birth, like Tiberius and Nero, who were bad, and those who were adopted by their predecessor, like Marcus Aurelius. So who was Marcus Aurelius, Emily, and how did he come to be emperor?
Yes, well, as you say, it was a run of quote-unquote good emperors, meaning emperors who had good relationships with the Senate. The senatorial caste is, of course, the history-writing class. So they're the ones who wrote the texts that said these are the good ones, as opposed to the emperors who were popular with the common people who didn't write texts that were preserved and then read by Machiavelli and Gibbon. So the 5 were Nerva, whose adopted son Trajan took over, whose adopted son Hadrian took over, whose adopted son Antoninus Pius took over, whose adopted sons Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius took over. And then the pattern was broken because Marcus Aurelius's biological son Commodus took over. So there was obviously this failure to have biological children, which meant that there was this very powerful ruling political elite, which involved a lot of marriage of cousins together in order to try to create some kind of quasi-bloodlines and adoptive bloodlines when there weren't any available. Marcus Aurelius was from a wealthy elite family, as of course the fact that he was in good with both Hadrian and Antoninus Pius suggests from a very young age. He became consul. He was appointed as consul when he was 19, which was very early to be sort of picked out as someone with potential for big political power. And he was also married to a woman called Faustina, who was the daughter of Antoninus Pius. So it's not just that he was the adoptive son of Antoninus Pius and sort of selected as a potential heir by that means, but also son-in-law. So he was sort of double heir in a way that his fellow emperor, Lucius Verus, was only sort of single adoptive heir. We know quite a lot about his life, obviously because he was an emperor and because he was powerful, and also because we have not only his meditations to himself, but also the letters in Latin as opposed to Greek between Marcus Aurelius and his early tutor, Fronto, who was a teacher in rhetoric. So he studied rhetoric and literature as every elite Roman of that period did. He obviously studied Greek literature and Greek philosophy as well as Roman literature, Roman rhetoric. The letters between him and Fronto tell us a lot about his studies of simile and meditations on Cicero, but also a lot of whining about his health. And we know a lot about his health conditions and his various ulcers and bad knees and his love of hunting, even though he kept getting further injuries as a result of this obsession with going off hunting, or then when he wasn't hunting, going off and battling the Gauls. So in the course of his reign as emperor, it had been a period of great peace, relatively speaking, in the Roman Empire. But then in the time that after Antoninus Pius's death, he lived for a long time and ruled for a long time, 23 years, I think. But after Antoninus Pius died and Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius took over, there was first war breaking out with the Parthians to the east and then the Germanic tribes to the west. So Marcus Aurelius was fighting in the last decade of his life in the Marcomannic Wars with the Germanic tribes to the northwest of Rome. Various advisors seem to have told him to let it go and let the Germanic tribes keep on pushing south because they didn't have a place to live up to the north. But Marcus Aurelius was committed to carrying on the wars. So there were a ton of wars and also a huge plague, which many people think was smallpox, which wiped out something like 10% of the population of the Roman Empire during his rule. So even though he's presented as the last of a golden age, it wasn't exactly a golden age for all the people who were slaughtered in the wars and all the people who died of the plague.
I mean, he knew what he was talking about when it came to the terrible things happening.
He had some terrible things happening. So maybe we should also just note, while we're on the biography topic, so he had this wife called Faustina, who had a lot of children by him. So obviously he was hoping to have a biological heir, but something like 12 or 13 of his children died. So the only surviving boy was Commodus, who took over.
And then presumably he could have adopted.
He could have adopted if he thought Commodus was no good. I mean, he was raising Commodus up to be the heir from a very young age. He took him on campaign with him when he was only a teenager. So he was trying to make it work. And, we can debate at the end of the show about whether or not Commodus was really so bad. I mean, that's debatable.
And the book that's known in English as Meditations, although its Latin title is Ad se ipsum, so to himself, but presumably that was a title that was given to it later as well. But it was written mostly in the last 10 years of his life, when he was mostly on campaign fighting in Germania. So I suppose one of the things that's quite important about it is he's not only the writer of this book, he's the implied reader of it as well.
Mm-hmm. He's the reader as well as the writer, and that really matters. I mean, it seems like it's not just sort of dashed off and then left. There are signs that he did revise it, but revise it presumably for the purpose of making it more useful as self-help, with the designated reader being primarily himself as opposed to anyone else. And so in contrast to other Stoics whose writings remain, like Epictetus or Seneca, who are writing for a public and writing to educate, and in the case of Seneca, to perform and show off in front of a public or a readership, Marcus Aurelius's book to himself is primarily self-help with one reader in mind above all, and designed to keep guiding him towards what he sees as the right philosophical path in terms of emotional equilibrium, and away from the temptations of rage and misanthropy and being horrible to people and getting too upset about things that don't matter, like your kids dying and plague and war and all these other things.
And the first book, Gregory Hayes gives it a title of Debts and Lessons. And so it's sort of a list of those to various people, and not only people, beginning with his grandfather and finishing with the gods. And should we listen to some of that now? This from book 1, chapter 17, which is where he lists what he owes to the gods.
That I had good grandparents, a good mother and father, a good sister, good teachers, good servants, relatives, friends, almost without exception, and that I never lost control of myself with any of them, although I had it in me to do that, and I might have, easily. But thanks to the gods, I was never put in that position, and so escaped the test. That I wasn't raised by my grandfather's girlfriend for longer than I was. That I didn't lose my virginity too early, and didn't enter adulthood until it was time. Put it off, even. That I had someone as a ruler and as a father who could keep me from being arrogant, and make me realise that even at court you can live without a troop of bodyguards and gorgeous clothes, lamps, sculpture, the whole charade. That you can behave almost like an ordinary person without seeming slovenly or careless as a ruler or when carrying out official obligations. That I had the kind of brother I did. One whose character challenged me to improve my own. One whose love and affection enriched my life. That my children weren't born stupid or physically deformed. That I wasn't more talented in rhetoric or poetry or other areas. If I'd felt that I was making better progress, I might never have given them up.
So do we take these as all being genuine? Mostly the things that he's thankful for, but that last one about being thankful that he wasn't a better writer in a book that he's writing, does he really mean that one?
Yes, and it seems, at least book 1 seems very polished, and it seems like he really has sort of gone back and edited the first draft and made it thematic. And some of the titles, one could give them very different titles, but the coherence of book 1 and the rhetorical polish of book 1 is very evident. And I think if you do read the correspondence between his teacher in rhetoric, Fronto, and Marcus Aurelius, you can see how he has, even though he presents himself as having given up all of the pretensions of books, and there's the famous moment later in the Meditations where he says, put away your books. He's formed by the books, right? And he's also, in some sense, doing some humble bragging in this passage where, he has the capacity to be dominant and mean and horrible to his family, and yet look at him, how much he managed to rise above it.
Yeah, and it's incredibly forbearing because they're really annoying, is the implication.
It's really annoying, I know, and almost everybody was okay, but it's kind of a close thing. And I guess I wanted to note a couple of things just that I think are interesting that one might not get from the translation. One is that losing your virginity is androthenai, so to become a man. I think that actually matters because the Meditations have quite a lot about what it is to be a man and what it means to live up to the responsibilities of being both a man and a Roman. And one can debate to what extent is being a man, as Marcus Aurelius conceives it, compatible either with being a Stoic philosopher or with being an emperor. So there's sort of anxiety about being a man, I think, in that line.
And that question, I mean, you mentioned earlier that he was made a consul when he was 19, and obviously in the, by this point, ancient history of the Republic, you couldn't become a consul till you were 42. So, I mean, there is something, I waited so long to become a man, but he was made consul at 19.
I waited so long, and yet, in fact, I got it before I was 20. Yes. Right. And that question of to what extent does he see his privilege as something that just sort of naturally happened to him? And I think that runs through Book 1, but maybe further through the Book of Meditations. I think that the adverb hegemonikos, which is translated in the Gregory Haynes translation as a ruler, is an important word because he's interested in what does it mean to deal with things in the manner of a hegemon, in the manner of a leader. And that for him entails being tapped into what the leading part of the soul or the leading part of the self is guiding him to do. But he also has this idea that even before he actually was the leader of the known world, he needed to be acting in the manner of a leader, which, of course, not everybody who lived in the Roman Empire would have thought I need to be always acting like a leader, because not everybody had the possibility of inheriting the throne, the imperial seat.
There's at least one place where he says, be neither master nor slave. It's kind of, that's easy for you to say.
Some people don't have much choice about that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Although, I mean, it's partly talking about, and you mentioned Epictetus, and you wrote about Epictetus for the LRB last year in 2023. And of course, he had been enslaved. Mm-hmm. So when Epictetus is writing about the different kinds of slavery and the idea of having a free mind, you slightly feel he knows whereof he speaks.
He knows about it in a way that Marcus Aurelius has an idea of, I don't want to act as anything other than a leader at all times, but he doesn't actually have any lived experience of what would the alternative be, because he's always been in the position of being a leader.
And I suppose you could argue that there is a sense in which that's a kind of, slavery is a strong word for it, but he doesn't have much choice about that. He was adopted to be the emperor very early because it wasn't part of Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, and one of the conditions of the adoption was that he would then adopt Marcus Aurelius.
That he would also adopt Marcus Aurelius, exactly, yes. So Hadrian also wanted to make sure that the succession was in place, not just for the next generation, but for the next after as well, by doing that. And he favoured Marcus Aurelius from a very young age and seems to have identified him as verissimus, as super honest or truthful or interested in, this theme that relates to our theme of truth and lies. What kinds of truthfulness did Hadrian identify in Marcus Aurelius at a young age? Maybe an interest in study and philosophy from a pretty young age, at least.
Yeah, and Stoicism, because didn't he start sleeping on the floor when he was 11? Is that...
That's said by some, yes. One can debate some of the ancient sources. The Historia Augusta is a notably late and dubious source, but maybe he did, yes.
Yeah, but it certainly said, the idea that he was trying not to say pious, but it does sound like a kind of piety. And he was
ascetic, yes. Even though he also, the sources are somewhat inconsistent about how ascetic was he. So I'd already talked a little bit on his health troubles. Of course, because he had this enormous privilege, he also had huge numbers of medical professionals waiting on him hand and foot and offering him all kinds of different remedies, many of which presumably made him worse than he already was. He had these ulcers and people standing around to check his pulse and bleed him and give him leeches and all that. But the philosopher Dr. Galen was one of his personal medics, and we have an anecdote from Galen saying that Galen showed up after 2 doctors had already been waiting on him and taking his pulse, and Galen didn't bother taking his pulse because that had already been taken, and it was clear that he didn't have a high fever or pulse issues. So instead it was just that he'd eaten too much, and he just needed to take a nap and sleep it off, which suggests that he wasn't actually that ascetic, right? I mean, sometimes his issues were just too many banquets or too much wine or too much of the theriac that Galen prescribed him, which is said to have contained opiates, as theriac or those kinds of doses often did. And he was said to be somewhat sleepy, and the focus on you need to get up in the mornings, which runs through the meditations. Maybe it's harder to get up in the mornings if you've had a lot of wine and a lot of theriac the night before.
Yeah, of course, a lot of the things the advice that he gives to himself, and he wouldn't need to give himself the advice if he didn't need to take it, as it were, in the way that he's endlessly telling himself not to be afraid of death. And you think, well, only someone who is quite afraid of death would have to tell themselves quite so often not to be.
Right.
Yeah, and similarly with as you say, with the
Similarly with the don't be so grumpy with everyone. Unless you actually feel really annoyed quite a lot of the time with all the people around you, you don't need to keep repeating that. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, the things about how difficult it is to get out of bed, because I mean, those are some of the nicest, if that's the word, bits of the meditations, really, because a lot of it, there's a lot of focused on what's he finds disgusting about bodies, and there's a lot of pus and blood and things being broken and all quite dispiriting. But then he gets to bits where, when you're lying in bed and thinking how nice and warm it is, you do have to get up early even so. And there are these sudden moments where there's a sort of relatable humanity comes through. Yes. So, well, should we have another reading now? One of the bits about waking up in the morning. This is from the beginning of book 2. And as you talked about hand and foot earlier, and there's a lot about hands and feet in this as well.
When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. Whatever this is that I am, it is flesh and a little spirit and an intelligence. Throw away your books. Stop letting yourself be distracted. That is not allowed. Instead, as if you were dying right now, despise your flesh. A mess of blood, pieces of bone, a woven tangle of nerves, veins, arteries. Consider what the spirit is. Air. And never the same air, but vomited out and gulped in again every instant. Finally, the intelligence. Think of it this way. You are an old man. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, and to mistrust the future.
So he was over 40 by then, so of course the awareness of the flesh weighs heavy by the time you're in your 40s.
And how much of that first bit is it still what he's telling himself to tell himself? So it's when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, they are like this, I have seen the beauty of good. Is that all still indirect speech, that tell yourself, I have seen the beauty of good, rather than making the claim that he has?
I mean, none of it's indirect speech. I mean, all of it's vivid, direct speech. We talked a lot about indirect speech and its uses in the symposium episode, I think. But anyway, it's not, we haven't really talked much about the style, but so much of it is not subordinated sentences or clauses. He could have written that with a subordinate clause with indirect speech, but he doesn't. It's all vivid. This is what's being said right now. What's being said right now is, I'm going to meet these fools and idiots, and what I'm going to feel is that I know so much more, but that also means that we're, as it were, adopted family. I mean, I think it's also interesting the images that he chooses. I mean, both that, as we emphasized at the start, he came from a long line of adopted kinspeople, and that the image that he's using here of the whole family is like the adopted brothers, like Lucius Verus or like Antoninus Pius, that he's in this adopted kinship network and he can extend that further to all humanity and to the parts of the body. And then also that he's drawing on his experiences of sickness and the battlefield in how he depicts the body, and constantly reminding himself that even if at this particular moment your body is inhabited by breath that's going in and out of it, that's still just air, in the way that you might realize that when you're confronting bodies on the battlefield or dead from plague or your dead children. So it's vivid. I mean, I guess one other thing just to say about the language is the way that he's sort of playing around with diminutives and also with imagery. I mean, that the moment in the translation where it's to be jerked about is a very unusual verb that suggests to be pulled by strings like a puppet. So he's, even though this isn't written to be a showcase of rhetorical elegance, he's playing with language, and he's playing with language also with things like using pneumation, like the little breath, as opposed to just the regular pneuma, the normal sized breath. It's the diminutive kind of breath. So you can sort of see that he's got a lot of rhetorical training, and even though he says he's no good at rhetoric, he's kind of good at it.
I mean, in the question of the working together, like two hands, two rows of teeth, that we often talk about him being the emperor, and in the way that when he's mentioned in Machiavelli's list, or that idea that his adoptive brother, who was co-emperor with him for the first five years, do we know how much he felt the loss of Lucius after he died?
I mean, I think it's hard to sort of see into the mind of someone from the past, given that we have very limited evidence about that. I don't know that we have evidence to know that. And similarly about the death of his children, the death of his wife, we know that he suffered all these losses. Which of them hit him hardest? I don't know how we would know that. But I think sort of pointing to the way that this is a passage about how there's both this sort of intimacy between the different parts of the body and also sort of alienation. I mean, there's a sense of... The passage sort of starts off with the idea that the body is these disparate elements that all work together, like the two rows of teeth work together, and here they are crunching together. And yet we break into... They're actually all disgusting, and they don't actually make any sense. And so I think that speaks both to someone who's experienced grief in his family, but also somebody who's experienced repeatedly the sense of the Roman Empire is impossible to keep together. It's this body that you can't hold on to, and he's constantly battling to try to hold on to it. And then this comes back to the word I mentioned before, or the cluster of words to do with being a hegemon. The intelligence is the hegemonikon, the part of the body that is the ruler. And so this is sort of struggle to have the ruler be doing the ruling, and yet all the other bits don't seem to be cooperating with the ruling. And that may be the case in the body, in the family, and in the empire.
Yeah, so the body is the body politic as well as his own body.
Yes.
And how much of a sense was there that the emperor was the empire? I mean, not just as Marcus Aurelius, but in ancient Rome as a whole, that the sense that the emperor was Rome in some sense. So if his body is decaying and collapsing, and the empire is also decaying and collapsing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that imagery, iconography of the emperor looking all hale and hearty and his family looking all hale and hearty was sort of part of what was spread all across the empire in messaging, in coinage and in statues, suggests that image of, you don't fund that number of statues and coins of Marcus Aurelius and his forebears looking great, unless you think that's a way of imaging this is what you're part of if you're managing to buy into the taxes and rule of Rome.
And he went off and fought on all these campaigns later, but is it right that when he became emperor at the age of 40, which is about the age when under an earlier dispensation he might have become co-consul with Lucius Verus, that he might never have left Italy, or that he'd never been on a campaign? He hadn't been a soldier?
Yeah, he doesn't seem to have had any particular experience, but he had plenty of political education and literary education and philosophical education, but no particular military experience as far as we know, I don't think.
And so when they were both alive, that it was Lucius who went off to fight the Parthians.
Lucius went off, even though Lucius was younger, but Lucius was sent off to fight the Parthians when the Parthian issues broke out. early in their joint rule and made a not very successful attempt to put the Parthians down. And Marcus stayed and managed the Senate and managed things back in court until things went wrong with the Germanic tribes. And then Marcus Aurelius went off to deal with that. And then kept having to go back and forth because plague was breaking out in Rome. So he went off to fight the Germanic tribes and then had to make a long trek back. And then when the Germanic tribes were still having issues and were still wanting to find new homelands.
And Fronto, who was his teacher as well as his correspondent.
Yeah, we could talk a bit more about him. So I think what's part of what I maybe said already, that the correspondence between Fronto and Marcus Aurelius also includes correspondence with other people Fronto was writing to, including Lucius Verus. It's in Latin as opposed to Greek, which means we, quite unusually for any ancient authors, we have bits of Marcus Aurelius in Latin as well as the Meditations, which is in his literary Greek. The correspondence with Fronto has been sort of studied in terms of, are these the only love letters from antiquity? There's a translation of the correspondence that goes under the title of Marcus Aurelius in Love, because it has a lot of the sort of tropes of, darling Fronto, I miss you so much, and how are you doing? I love you so much, and I'm desperate without you, and I'm counting the hours till I see you again. And since we have so few sort of intimate letters between elite men from this period, it's sort of unclear, does that show they were actually having sex, or they were in love in some sense beyond just they got along fine and it was a way of being polite to say, dearest so-and-so, and I love you so much. Anyway, but it's striking from a modern perspective just how much expressions of love and affection there is in that correspondence. And then it's also striking, given how many carissime Fronto gestures there are in the letters, that Fronto plays such a small part in the Meditations, and that Marcus Aurelius in Book 1, as we've said, sort of goes all out about certain people, but doesn't go all out about Fronto. And presumably that's of a piece with the moment that we've just seen of him gesturing towards, he's glad he wasn't sucked into being too talented in rhetoric, and that Fronto was trying to seduce him, not just in the sense of calling him darling boy and telling him how beautiful he was, but also in the sense of teaching him rhetoric and pulling him away from what became his true love, which was philosophy.
And in the brief mention of him in Book 1, that he's thanked for teaching Marcus to recognise the malice, cunning and hypocrisy that power produces, and the peculiar ruthlessness often shown by people from good families, which is quite an interesting thing to pick out.
It's an interesting way to praise him, and the fact that he doesn't praise him for any of what he was explicitly teaching him, like, he taught me how to read, he taught me how to write, he taught me how to appreciate Cicero. Doesn't say any of that. I didn't mean taught him how to read literally, but
No, of course.
Taught him how to do close reading.
Yes. He talks about the body and the air and the intelligence and this sort of tripartite division of the self, I suppose. Is that the standard Stoic teaching or some other?
I mean, there's a lot of debate about to what extent was Marcus Aurelius really interested in philosophy as opposed to sort of self-help or ethics. I mean, I think it's fairly standard, right? I mean, there's a division of the spirit and intelligence from the material world, which of course runs through Platonism and the academy and the traditions that come out of Platonism as well as through Stoicism. So I'm not sure that one can say that in particular is specifically Stoic as opposed to generically philosophical.
So we've talked about Stoicism a bit before in previous episodes and previous series, talking about Seneca and so on, but maybe we should have a very quick recap of what Stoicism as understood by Marcus Aurelius was.
Yes. So Stoicism was one of the several philosophical traditions, philosophical schools that began in the Greek Hellenistic period, along with Epicureanism, which focused on the idea that human well-being, eudaimonia, which is sometimes rendered as happiness, Stoics suggested that human well-being is centered on virtue, which comes about when you are in tune with nature. So following nature, and nature, according to the Stoics, is more or less identical with the purposes of the universe and the purposes of the deity, who's sometimes identified with Jupiter or Zeus. And you get yourself in tune with what is and what must be. And by doing that, you realize that most of the things you think matter do not in fact matter. So they had a whole theory both of physics, logic, and ethics and psychology, whereby it's a sort of rationalizing philosophy where once you recognize the only thing that really matters for your well-being is your own virtue and your own ability to be in tune with nature. Once you realize that, then all the things that you're angry about, all the things that you're upset about, all the things that you want, you don't actually want any of that stuff. And you don't care about the fact that somebody supposedly did you wrong because he didn't actually do you any wrong, because he didn't damage your virtue. So it's sort of drawing on some threads in Plato and in Socratic philosophy, but extending it to a whole system, which includes an idea of physics in the universe and logic games as well. So they had ideas of the passions, meaning the false emotions, which are based on false cognition. Stoicism, unlike Epicureanism, had room for political engagement. The Epicureans suggested that the way to maximize your well-being was to hang out with friends and not take part in public life, whereas the Stoics thought that the active public life is part of your duty and your virtue as a human being, especially as a male human being. So it was popular in Rome among Roman male political elites. And so we could have a whole longer episode about the relationship of Roman Stoicism to earlier forms of Stoicism, but Marcus Aurelius is in that tradition of Roman Stoicism, following from Seneca and Epictetus, who, as we've said, was a Stoic teacher who had been enslaved. And he's drawing from various teachers that he'd had within that Roman Stoic tradition, focused on Stoicism as a kind of self-help that's compatible with being a very powerful, rich man.
And Marcus Aurelius certainly seemed to see it as that. There's a bit, isn't there, where he talks about philosophy as an ointment. I mean, he sort of saw it as a way to help him get through his busy day as an emperor.
Yes. I mean, I already mentioned that he had a ton of sort of doctors for the physical health elements, for his ulcers and his bad knees and all that. But philosophy and his philosophical teachers add something for the psychological stresses of being an emperor and for the tendency towards rage and the fear of death, which Stoicism addresses by saying doesn't matter.
And there's that, I'll say a famous bit, but there's a passage is it in book 11 where he says, when you kiss your son goodnight, Epictetus teaches us to tell yourself he may be dead in the morning.
Yes, the same line comes from Epictetus. Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes. As you kiss your little child goodnight, tell yourself that child may well be dead by morning, which of course happened to Marcus Aurelius multiple times.
Which could be a way of, I mean, you don't have to tell yourself these things don't matter unless you feel that they really do matter. I mean, that's quite important that he doesn't...
Yes, if you didn't actually mind about your child at all, then you wouldn't feel you needed to go through that exercise. Yes.
Yeah.
So it doesn't suggest complete inhumanity or coldness.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of the opposite of it. I mean, it's a different way of trying to manage grief, but it's not.
Yes.
Yeah. But also, he's not consistent in his... I was about to say his teachings, but of course the meditations aren't really teachings there because they're notes to himself. It's not a coherent, logical system that he's putting forward to teach other people about it. So in a way, those apparent contradictions don't matter. But there's a bit where he talks about how the mind is a fortress that you can retreat into away from the world. But then quite soon afterwards, he says that you have to let others in.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these opposite movements. And another one that he's one of the repeated, I keep wanting to say lessons, I suppose they are lessons, I mean they're lessons to himself, is about
Yes, they can be lessons.
Everything's transient, everything will pass, nothing matters because it's so brief that, we're on this earth for such a short amount of time, and the life of a single human being is, just a moment in eternity. And everything's constantly changing, but then he says, but then it's always, nothing really changes for the same sorts of reasons. And I mean, are these, the idea that everything's constantly in flux, but nothing really changes, is it a contradiction, or is it, maybe it doesn't matter if it is?
Yeah, I don't think it is necessarily. I mean, it's compatible with an orthodox Stoic idea that there's a large cosmic cycle, and eventually the universe we know will go up in flames, and then a new one will come into being. But nature or Zeus or the will of the universe is going to remain constant, and there'll still be the constancy both on the level of cosmology and physics and also on the level of the only thing that matters in humanity is virtue according to Stoic ethics, and being in tune with the universe and letting go of those false passions and embracing only your ability to be the right kind of person.
There's that thing that Satan says in Paradise Lost that the mind is its own place and in itself can make...
And of itself can make a heaven of hell, hell of heaven, yes.
And I mean, that sounds like
It's Stoicism.
That's Stoic
Yes.
doctrine. So
Yes.
if Milton's Satan is, in that sense at least, is trying to be stoical.
Yes, I mean, I think Milton's pretty explicit about the ways that Satan is both a Stoic and a kind of Odysseus, and those figures were associated by people before Milton. Yes, he's got that, both the tension that you were talking about of, is there actually a contradiction between how changeable or how constant Satan or the Stoic is, but that also that focus on the self, which I think is part of how Milton is trying to showcase what might be wrong with Stoicism, is that it's an invitation to narcissism. And he's focused only on his own mind.
In that piece that you wrote for the LRB about Epictetus, you talk about his charm and how charming a lot of Epictetus's writings are, which I'm not sure it's a word that often applies to Marcus, but he does have his moments, doesn't he? And there are, when he does see beauty in the world and talk about beauty. And there's a bit in which we could perhaps listen to from book 3, where he talks about... But in fact, Gregory Hayes uses the word charm in his translation.
We should remember that even nature's inadvertence has its own charm, its own attractiveness. The way loaves of bread split open on top in the oven, the ridges are just byproducts of the baking, and yet pleasing somehow. They rouse our appetite without our knowing why. Or how ripe figs begin to burst. And olives on the point of falling, the shadow of decay gives them a peculiar beauty. Stalks of wheat bending under their own weight, the furrowed brow of the lion, flecks of foam on the boar's mouth, and other things. If you look at them in isolation, there's nothing beautiful about them, and yet by supplementing nature, they enrich it and draw us in. And anyone with a feeling for nature, a deeper sensitivity, will find it all gives pleasure. Even what seems inadvertent. He'll find the jaws of live animals as beautiful as painted ones or sculptures. He'll look calmly at the distinct beauty of old age in men, women, and at the loveliness of children. And other things like that will call out to him constantly. Things unnoticed by others. Things unnoticed by others. Things seen only by those at home with nature and its works.
So that's not about the mucus and the ulcers and all the rest of it. It's a different...
It's a different approach to how do we respond to things that might be reminiscent of death and of mortality and limits, right? I mean, that each of these examples are to do with things that are almost quasi-dead, the figs that are almost rotten, the olives that are almost dropped and off the tree. The shadow of decay gives a peculiar beauty. So it's a way of thinking about death in a way that's not so painful, the sort of counterpart to the way that he can contemplate the banquet and look at all this disgusting stuff. And this just reminds me of being that I'm going to be dead soon. That it's also a reminder in this passage of how there's beauty in feeling in following nature, according to what a Stoic is supposed to do, which is follow nature and realize that each stage of the life path is beautiful.
And maybe that's what he understood by truth, or the people who praised him for truth, that living in part of nature, seeing the world as it is, accepting your part in it, there's a kind of truth, I guess, to that.
There's a kind of truth to that, and that there's also something where I think it's interesting how he goes from these not at all violent images of the bread and the figs to these much more violent images of these jaws of live animals, which presumably is a gladiatorial image or a hunting image, but much more likely it's this is what it's like to be in the arena and look at the lions who are about to eat someone, and I'm just contemplating how beautiful they are. And it's sort of a way of aestheticizing. And again, in a way, one could say he's sort of promoting himself, even if he's just doing it to himself and saying, when I go to watch the shows, I'm not doing it in a sort of in the way the plebs would, where they would just be excited about the spectacle of violence. Instead, I'm just looking at nature. And yeah.
And also that he'll look calmly at the distinct beauty of old age in men, and that where he's been previously and elsewhere, he talks about not to feel too sad about the way that his body is getting old and failing. Here he's trying to be even more positive about it and say it's not just something not to worry about, it's something to be embraced because it's part of nature.
Yes. I mean, I think it's interesting that this passage is in the third person, that he's not saying you will do this, he's saying he will do this, and which one could take to mean it's quite difficult to do this and he can't quite imagine himself doing it. And he's not saying I do this, he's saying some hypothetical person who was better at this philosophy stuff than I am would be able to do that.
And the question of what he himself should be like. And I mean, you've talked already about being like a leader and like a good leader, but he has also this sense of not being like a bad leader. And there's this quite interesting, there's a word that Gregory Hayes translates as imperialization, which may be slightly misleading in terms of what we think about the ways in which imperialism is not good and so on. That wasn't quite the sense in which he meant it. Should we listen to that bit now?
Yes.
So this is from book 6.
To escape imperialization, that indelible stain, it happens. Make sure you remain straightforward, upright, reverent, serious, unadorned, an ally of justice, pious, kind, affectionate, and doing your duty with a will. Fight to be the person philosophy tried to make you. Revere the gods. Watch over human beings. Our lives are short. The only rewards of our existence here are an unstained character and unselfish acts. Take Antoninus as your model. Always. His energy in doing what was rational, his steadiness in any situation, his sense of reverence, his calm expression, his gentleness, his modesty, his eagerness to grasp things, and how he never let things go before he was sure he had examined them thoroughly, understood them perfectly. The way he put up with unfair criticism without returning it, how he couldn't be hurried, how he wouldn't listen to informers, how reliable he was as a judge of character and of actions, not prone to backbiting or cowardice or jealousy or empty rhetoric, content with the basics in living quarters, bedding, clothes, food, servants. How hard he worked, how much he put up with, his ability to work straight through till dusk because of his simple diet. He didn't even need to relieve himself except at set times. His constancy and reliability as a friend, his tolerance of people who openly questioned his views, and his delight at seeing his ideas improved on, his piety, without a trace of superstition, so that when your time comes, your conscience will be as clear as his.
So the Greek verb is apokaisarotes. So don't turn into a Caesar. Don't Caesarify yourself. So there's a distinction between the regular Greek term hegemon, leader, and Caesarification, being a specifically Roman Caesar of the wrong kind. The spectre of Julius Caesar, who was aiming at the wrong kind of power and got assassinated, is obviously lingering over that model, but then also the memory of the quote-unquote bad emperors. He doesn't want to be a Caligula or be the wrong kind of Caesar and instead be the right kind of Golden Age emperor, which means being a hegemon, not a Kaiser.
But of course, there are compliments to himself in there as well. That his adopted father, who adopted him to become emperor, was such a good judge of character.
Exactly, yes. unstained character, and here he is being totally unstained himself, yes.
Yeah. And saying, yeah. But then also that his body and, his regular bowel movements and all the rest of these things, which is slightly strange.
It's very strange, but it's also, you can see how it's self-help in the sense that it's self-comfort in that it's praising himself as well as his family and adopted father, in that he's sort of reminding himself that he can see himself as all the things that he lists.
Yeah, while also, falling, acknowledging the ways in which he, or elsewhere acknowledging the ways in which he falls short.
One thing is, I think, so maybe a couple of things to pick up just from the beginning of that passage is the way that he has the imagery of fighting. And of course, he was doing so much literal fighting. I mean, the term for fighting there is agonisai. So it's as if it's a competitive sport kind of fighting as opposed to real killing people kind of fighting. But to me, it's interesting how he has that focus on doing what Gregory Haynes calls unselfish acts. So it's a word that comes up repeatedly in the Meditations, these cognates for koinonikos. So rather than unselfish suggests it's the opposite of something bad, whereas the Greek word koinonikos means common or to do with other people, to do with communalness. So doing things that express your connection with other people and with community. And of course, that's picked up also with the watch over human beings. But to me, it's interesting how he doesn't actually clarify which human beings are you watching over and how are you watching over them by making all these military campaigns on them. I mean, we know that various advisors, including Lucius Verus, advised Marcus Aurelius to pull out of the wars with the Germanic tribes. And I think it's interesting to try and wrestle with, are there moments in the Meditations where he seems as if he might be thinking about what is common in ways that might include the people who aren't Roman? Or is it that he thinks of human beings as the Roman human beings or the people in my court?
There are definitely moments, are there, where he seems to say explicitly that that all human beings are one. Well, I'm trying to find the word, but don't want to say race, but he does seem to have a sense that all of humanity counts.
He does, yes. Which, but I think it's sort of interesting that given that he seems also in his day job where he's not writing the Meditations, he was so much set on not just maintaining the boundaries of the Roman Empire, but extending it at the cost of a big death toll for both Romans and the people against whom the Romans were fighting.
But would he have had a sense that extending the Pax Romana, as it were, would ultimately benefit the people who were being conquered?
It benefits humanity as a whole to have more Romanitas all across the cosmos. Yes, I mean, he doesn't actually make that argument, but presumably that's the thinking. Yes, that humans are ultimately better off if these Germanic tribes don't get their way.
Yeah, and if human life is so short anyway, and we shouldn't fear death and all the rest of it, maybe killing a whole load of people doesn't really matter in the great scheme of things.
Grand scheme of things, they would have been dead anyway. It's only a tiny number of extra days, one way or the other. Yes. One thing I also wanted to emphasize just about the language is that, of course, the Gregory Hayes translation inevitably has a lot more words than the original does. I mean, so many of these phrases in the translation are single terms in the Greek, and things like "our lives are short," which is 4 words, "brachus hobios." I mean, it's very, very short, and it's sort of giving you this sort of in-your-face list of concept, word, and you don't actually need a whole sentence even to spread out to express what these concepts are. You might not have time for that because you're going to be dead soon.
And this question of the idea of the whole of humanity and the body politic and the separation these are all things that we've already talked about, but there's a passage from Book 8 which we could maybe listen to now, which has, it returns to many of these themes.
Have you ever seen a severed hand or foot, or a decapitated head just lying somewhere far away from the body it belonged to? That's what we do to ourselves, or try to, when we rebel against what happens to us, when we segregate ourselves, or when we do something selfish. You have torn yourself away from unity, your natural state, one you were born to share in. Now you've cut yourself off from it. But you have one advantage here. You can reattach yourself. a privilege God has granted to no other part of no other whole, to be separated, cut away, and reunited. But look how he's singled us out. He's allowed us to not be broken off in the first place. And when we are, he's allowed us to return, to graft ourselves back on and take up our old position once again. Part of a whole.
So, I mean, that question, he obviously has seen a lot of severed hands and heads and feet, things that it might be. He's using it as a symbol, but he's beginning from something very concrete that's very real to him.
Yes, from something that he's got autoptic knowledge of, witness of. I mean, he phrases it in a weirdly distanced way. Like a more literal translation would be, if you've ever seen a severed hand. But presumably Marcus Aurelius knows that he has in fact seen several hands and heads and so forth, because he's spent so many years on the battlefront. And then he's using this vivid image of these body parts that can't be sewn back. I mean, maybe this goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago of what were the motivations for his insistence on the wholeness of the empire, including these elements that are trying to cut themselves off, that he actually wanted the wholeness of the body politic, including this enormous and unwieldy empire, to get grafted back together, as well as for the wholeness of the self, which means both the individual self and the joining of the individual self with nature and with the whole cosmos.
And I mean, is there some claim in which that he's trying to say that by his military campaigns, which appear to be cutting people to pieces, are in fact part of a larger mission of unification?
Yes, I mean, I don't think that's explicit in this particular passage, but I think the fact that he moves from the chopping up of body parts towards an image of wholeness and grafting, that's explicitly to do with a philosophical kind of wholeness, or a psychological, emotional kind of wholeness where you can be in tune with nature. But I think implicitly one can see that as related to what he's doing with the Germanic tribes, that he may seem to be chopping people's heads off, but he's actually grafting this severed bit of the empire back onto the empire, and the body can be whole again.
But I mean, on the other hand, there's that very short chapter of Book 10, Chapter 10, where it seems a sort of a flash of insight almost into that spiders are proud of catching flies, men of catching hares, fish in a net, boars, bears, Sarmatians, criminal psychology. So that maybe what he's doing with these wars of conquest is no different from a spider catching flies in a web.
Exactly. I mean, that passage is much debated, but it seems as if he also seems to be at least momentarily admitting that there's a continuity between the self who enjoys going out hunting for fun and hunting boars, which is a socially acceptable thing to say you're doing just for fun. Maybe hunting the Germanic tribes is also for fun, not just for manliness and Romanness and imperialness and being a good leader, but also just because it's kind of cool to be hunting people in the wild, which is what he was doing for most of the last part of his life.
And did he die on campaign, or at the end of campaign?
Well, so the wars were still ongoing, and he died in a military one of the many Roman military camps all across Germania and Romania in what's now Austria.
Okay, it's I get distracted by the version in the movie. No, that's right. In the movie Gladiator, where he's just finished the campaign in Germany. I mean, one of the things in that very un-Marcus Aurelian, apparently un-Marcus Aurelian lines from that movie is that Russell Crowe's character Maximus says, "What we do in life echoes in eternity." And Marcus Aurelius at least he's always saying that it doesn't matter. We're even the great people whose names we do remember. The very few people whose names we remember are long dead, and sort of the opposite of that. But did he really think that, or would he have liked to think that obviously you can't answer this, but do you get the sense Yes. He would have liked to think that people would still be reading him 2,000 years later?
I mean, we've talked already about you don't go on about the fear of death unless you're quite frightened of death. You also don't go on about anxieties about your reputation unless you're quite worried about your reputation. And I think that constant harping on what can he learn from earlier emperors is a way of articulating a preoccupation with how will I go down in history and how will people remember me. So, yes, I think he cared about that stuff for sure. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he was fighting against the fact that he cared about it, but he cared about it for sure.
I mean, and his immediate political legacy, I guess, would have been Commodus's succession and reign. I mean, was it as much of a disaster as it's said to be?
Yeah, I mean, a generation ago in terms of ancient history scholarship, people followed the kind of patchy ancient sources in presenting Commodus, who had a much shorter reign and was assassinated, and there were lots and lots of intrigues between different factions in Rome when Commodus took over, because, of course, he was very young for the role and seems to have been much less interested in either philosophy than his father or in making war, and was much more interested in having fun partying. And some people didn't think that was a good idea for an emperor. I mean, I think one can argue that the fact that Commodus signed treaties with these warring Germanic tribes, and there was actually peace, relatively speaking, in that part of the world for the next 2 or 3 generations, suggests it wasn't so bad. I mean, that he managed to make peace where his father had not made peace and had just continued making war. And there's no evidence that Commodus was sort of universally hated. He was not liked by the Senate and was not liked by some factions, but he seems to have been pretty popular with the army because the army didn't want to be on campaign forever and ever. So, I mean, it kind of depends who you ask, I think, whether Commodus was a disaster or not.
And as for the longer-term legacy of Marcus's thought and writings, the Meditations are still quite widely read and quoted, perhaps more quoted than read. Claire Hall, in a recent piece on Galen for the LRB, began by saying that Galen couldn't stand gym bros. Marcus's teachings are popular with tech bros. I mean, what is it about them that seems to appeal so much to a certain kind of modern man?
It's so funny, isn't it? I mean, the Silicon Valley version of Stoicism seems to get more and more popular. And of course, I mean, the fact that we've emphasized this is self-help for someone in a position of enormous privilege, which doesn't ask you to interrogate your privilege and instead sort of leans into it, where you were born to be a leader and you can be even more leaderish and even more of a bro boss if you do a tiny bit of, you don't even have to read very much of it. Just spend 5 minutes reading, because it's also the kind of book that you can get a little bit out of and get most of the gist of it with 5 minutes of reading labor. So I think there are many reasons why it's as popular as it is, especially with the tech bros, but not just with them, right? I mean, it's striking to me that, you know, I've been teaching at a university level for decades, and Marcus Aurelius is not usually part of the university syllabus in most places. And yet I've looked up some various bestseller lists, and it's always almost at the top, and it's always sort of in the top 500 of all books on Amazon. It's extraordinarily best-selling nowadays, which means it's not just Elon Musk who's reading it, or buying it at least, even if he's not reading it. It's a lot of people who are buying it and thinking this is going to give them some kind of insight into how to live. And of course, the fact that it does dig into things that we all wrestle with, about fear of death and other people, and, you know, how do we deal with change and the temptation to be furious or annoyed all the time. Those are relatable issues, even if the actual lived experience of Marcus Aurelius was not relatable whatsoever, because most people are not Roman emperors.
But also that he'd lived through a pandemic and an economic collapse and these things. So there are ways, even though he'd
Absolutely,
not referring...
yes.
Yeah.
So times of huge change. Yes, so Stoicism is a philosophy for times of huge social upheaval and change, and for people who are experiencing lack of political power and anger and lack of agency as a result. It gives you that sense of agency in a time where you feel that you don't have any. And that also suggests why is it appealing to people who don't have power as well as those who do.
Yeah, and sometimes in tweet length bites.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, in fact, I don't know if there's a Marcus Aurelius bot, but there should be. I mean, it seems like it's made for that. Yes.
Yeah. Emily Wilson, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.